I'll never forget the day a store manager tried to humiliate me over a $20 purchase at the electronics store. She had no idea I was married to the man who actually owned the entire mall where she worked. I was just buying a simple phone charger that day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Hey everyone, I'm Rachel, and today I'm sharing the most shocking experience that completely transformed my perspective on how we treat each other. Before I dive into this incredible story, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. Trust me, you're going to want to hear every single detail of what unfolded that day. Let me take you back to that life-changing afternoon that showed me the true power of staying humble, no matter what your circumstances are. My name is Rachel Thompson, and I'm 27 years old. My life today is nothing like what anyone would expect when they discover I'm married to one of the most successful real estate moguls in the state. But it wasn't always this way, and that's exactly why what happened that day affected me so deeply. 3 years ago, I was working as a freelance graphic designer, living in a small studio apartment above a bakery downtown. I was barely making ends meet, taking on any design project I could find, from wedding invitations to small business logos. My biggest luxury was my weekly coffee from the cafe across the street, and even that felt like a splurge most months. I wore the same 3 pairs of jeans in rotation, shopped at thrift stores, and drove a 15-year-old Honda that made concerning noises whenever I went up hills. That's when I met David at a community art exhibition, where I was displaying some of my work. He wasn't there as some wealthy patron or collector. He was just a guy who seemed genuinely interested in local artists and their stories. David spent almost an hour talking to me about my designs, asking thoughtful questions about my creative process, and listening with real interest when I explained the inspiration behind each piece. He didn't mention what he did for work, didn't flash expensive clothes or watches, and certainly didn't act like someone who owned half the commercial real estate in our city. When he offered to buy one of my smaller pieces, a digital art print I'd priced at $40, he paid without hesitation and even asked if I had business cards. For weeks after that, we'd run into each other at coffee shops, bookstores, and local events. Our conversations were easy and natural. He made me laugh, challenged my thinking, and never once made me feel like I wasn't interesting enough or successful enough to deserve his attention. David seemed like the kind of person who genuinely cared about others, who valued authenticity over appearances. When he finally asked me out for dinner, I said yes, because he made me feel comfortable being exactly who I was. Our first date was at a small Italian restaurant downtown, nothing fancy or pretentious, just good food and great conversation. It wasn't until our 4th date, when he picked me up in a car that probably cost more than I'd made in the past 2 years combined, that I began to realize David Thompson wasn't just some regular guy with an interest in art. He was David Thompson, founder and CEO of Thompson Development Group, the company responsible for building 3 of the largest shopping centers in our metropolitan area, along with dozens of office buildings, residential complexes, and commercial spaces throughout the region. His company wasn't just successful, it was the kind of business empire that shaped entire neighborhoods and influenced local economic development. When I Googled his name that night after our date, I found articles in business journals calling him a visionary, discussing his innovative approaches to sustainable commercial development and his reputation for revitalizing struggling commercial areas. But here's what made David different from every wealthy person I'd ever imagined. He never let his success change how he treated people. During our entire courtship, he continued to be the same thoughtful, down-to-earth man I'd met at that art exhibition. He was genuinely interested in my work, supportive of my dreams, and never once made me feel like I should change anything about myself to fit into his world. When we talked about our future together, he consistently emphasized that he'd fallen in love with who I was, not who I might become if I started wearing designer clothes or carrying expensive purses. Our wedding 18 months later was a small, intimate ceremony in his family's backyard garden, surrounded by close friends and relatives. No society photographers, no elaborate displays of wealth, just 2 people who genuinely loved each other making a commitment in front of the people who mattered most to them. David insisted that our relationship stay grounded in the same values that had brought us together: authenticity, kindness, and respect for others regardless of their circumstances. But adjusting to life as the wife of someone so successful has been one of the most challenging aspects of our marriage. David constantly encourages me to dress however makes me feel comfortable, to pursue my artistic interests, and never to change my fundamental personality to please others or fit into social expectations. While his support means everything to me, it's not always easy to maintain that authenticity when you're suddenly surrounded by people who judge everything from your handbag to your hairstyle. I still prefer my comfortable jeans, my vintage t-shirts, and my worn leather jacket that I've had since college. David says it's one of the qualities he loves most about me, that I haven't allowed his world to fundamentally alter who I am at my core. But sometimes that commitment to staying true to myself comes with unexpected consequences, as I was about to learn in the most dramatic way possible. About 4 months ago, David started receiving concerning reports about customer service issues at Westfield Plaza, the largest shopping center in his portfolio. The complaints were coming from multiple sources: customers, other store managers, even some of his own maintenance staff. People were saying that certain store employees, particularly at some of the higher-end retailers, were treating shoppers rudely based on their appearance, making assumptions about people's spending power, and creating an unwelcoming atmosphere that was driving business away from the entire mall. David takes these kinds of complaints very seriously. His business philosophy has always been that shopping centers should be welcoming spaces for everyone, regardless of their economic status. He believes that creating inclusive, respectful environments is not just the right thing to do morally, but it's also good business practice that leads to higher customer satisfaction and increased long-term revenue for all the stores in his properties. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Unfortunately, David was dealing with a major acquisition at the time, negotiating the purchase of a struggling shopping center in a neighboring city that he hoped to renovate and revitalize. The project required him to travel constantly, meeting with investors, city planners, architects, and contractors. He was essentially living out of hotels for weeks at a time, working 18-hour days to put together a deal that could potentially save hundreds of jobs and bring new economic opportunities to an underserved community. That's when I volunteered to help investigate the customer service complaints. It seemed like a straightforward assignment. Visit the mall, observe how customers were being treated, and report back on any problems I witnessed. I thought it would be simple to blend in as a regular shopper and get an authentic sense of what the customer experience was really like. I had no idea that I was about to become the perfect target for exactly the kind of discriminatory treatment that customers had been complaining about. The morning I decided to visit Westfield Plaza, I dressed the way I always do when I'm running errands or doing casual shopping. I put on my most comfortable pair of dark blue jeans, the ones that are perfectly broken in and make me feel confident and relaxed. I added a soft gray cotton sweater that David had given me for my birthday. Nothing fancy or designer, just a beautiful, comfortable sweater that I absolutely loved. Over that, I wore my trusty brown leather jacket, the one I'd bought at a thrift store during my struggling artist days and had never been able to bring myself to replace, even though David had offered to buy me a dozen new jackets. I slipped on my favorite pair of white canvas sneakers, the kind that are practical and comfortable for walking around a large mall, and instead of carrying one of the expensive designer purses David had surprised me with over the years, I grabbed my everyday crossbody bag, a simple black canvas bag with multiple pockets that I'd been using for years. I left most of my jewelry at home, wearing only my simple wedding ring and small silver earrings that had been a gift from my sister. Looking in the mirror before I left the house, I saw exactly what I hoped to see: a normal 27-year-old woman heading out for some casual shopping. I looked approachable, unpretentious, and completely ordinary, which was perfect for the kind of undercover observation I was planning to do. I wanted to blend in with regular customers, to experience the mall exactly the way any average shopper would experience it. Westfield Plaza is David's pride and joy among his commercial properties. It's a massive 2-level complex with over 100 stores, ranging from major department stores and popular chain retailers to smaller specialty shops and boutiques. The architecture is modern and inviting, with lots of natural light streaming through skylights, comfortable seating areas throughout the corridors, and beautiful landscaping that creates a pleasant, welcoming atmosphere. David personally oversaw every detail of the renovation when his company acquired the property 5 years ago, and he's constantly making improvements to ensure it remains a premier shopping destination. As I walked through the main entrance that afternoon, I should have felt proud. This was my husband's vision brought to life, a space designed to bring people together and support dozens of local businesses. Instead, I found myself feeling slightly nervous about the mission I was on. I hoped I wouldn't encounter any problems, that the complaints had been isolated incidents or misunderstandings that had been blown out of proportion. I decided to start my investigation at TechZone Express, one of the electronics stores located near the center of the mall. It was a mid-sized store that specialized in phone accessories, computer supplies, and small electronics, the kind of place where regular people go to buy practical items like phone chargers, USB cables, or tablet cases. It seemed like the perfect location to observe normal customer interactions without drawing attention to myself. The moment I walked into TechZone Express, I could tell something was off about the atmosphere. The store wasn't particularly busy, just a few customers browsing the aisles, but there was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite identify. The sales staff, 2 young men and 1 woman who appeared to be the manager, were clustered near the register having what looked like a very serious conversation in low voices. I browsed slowly through the phone accessory section, looking for a car charger for my phone since my current one had been giving me problems. It was the kind of simple, practical purchase that any regular customer might make, nothing expensive or complicated. I found what I was looking for pretty quickly, a basic car charger that was priced at exactly $20, perfect for what I needed. As I made my way toward the checkout counter, I noticed that the conversation among the staff members had stopped, and all 3 of them were now watching me with expressions that seemed surprisingly intense for such a routine interaction. The woman, who was wearing a name tag that read Victoria Store Manager, had shoulder-length blonde hair styled in a way that looked professionally done, and she was wearing a crisp white blouse with black dress pants that clearly indicated her management position. Victoria's expression as she watched me approach the counter was not welcoming. Instead of the friendly customer service demeanor that you'd expect from a store manager, she looked annoyed, almost suspicious, as if my presence in her store was somehow problematic. The 2 male employees, both appearing to be in their early 20s, seemed to be taking cues from her attitude, neither of them offering the usual greeting that customers typically receive when they're ready to make a purchase. I placed the $20 car charger on the counter and smiled politely, expecting a normal, straightforward transaction. Instead, Victoria looked down at my selection with an expression that I can only describe as disdainful, as if the item I was purchasing was somehow beneath the standards of her store. "Is this all you're buying today?" she asked, her tone suggesting that my $20 purchase was insufficient or disappointing in some way that I couldn't understand. There was something in her voice, a subtle condescension that immediately made me feel uncomfortable, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why a simple question about my purchase felt so loaded with judgment. "Yes, just the charger," I replied, trying to maintain a friendly tone despite the odd atmosphere. "I've been having problems with my current one, and this looks like exactly what I need." Victoria's response was to let out a small, dismissive laugh that seemed entirely inappropriate for the situation. She picked up the charger and examined it as if it were somehow defective or unworthy of her attention, then looked back at me with an expression that made me feel like I had somehow failed to meet her expectations as a customer. $20, she said, stating the obvious price with a tone that suggested the amount was simultaneously too small to be worth her time and too large for someone like me to afford comfortably. There was something in the way she said it that made me feel judged, as if she was making assumptions about my financial situation based on my appearance. That's when I realized I was witnessing exactly the kind of behavior that customers had been complaining about. Victoria wasn't just being unhelpful. She was actively creating an unwelcoming environment based on her perception of me as a customer. The way she was treating me had nothing to do with anything I had said or done, and everything to do with whatever assumptions she was making about me based on my casual clothing and modest purchase. I decided to proceed with my purchase, curious to see just how far Victoria's unprofessional behavior would escalate. "I'll take it," I said simply, pulling out my wallet from my canvas bag. The $20 bill I had was slightly crumpled from being in my pocket, nothing unusual for cash that had been carried around for a few days. Victoria stared at the bill as if it were contaminated, holding it between 2 fingers like it might be fake or dirty. "Cash, huh?" she said with obvious disdain. "I suppose you don't have a credit card?" The implication was clear. She was suggesting that people who pay with small bills in cash are somehow less legitimate customers than those who use credit cards for every purchase. I prefer cash for small purchases, I replied calmly, though I was becoming increasingly amazed by her attitude. This was exactly the kind of discriminatory treatment that the complaints had described, and I was experiencing it firsthand over a simple $20 transaction. Victoria made a show of examining the bill under the light, as if checking for counterfeits, which was completely ridiculous for such a small amount. "We've been having problems with people trying to pass fake 20s, she announced loudly, clearly intended for other customers in the store to hear. "You'd be surprised how many people think they can fool us with obvious fakes." The accusation was so outrageous and unnecessary that I almost laughed. The $20 bill was perfectly legitimate, obviously real, and her performance was clearly designed to embarrass me rather than address any genuine concern about counterfeit money. I realized that Victoria was putting on this show because she had already decided, based purely on my appearance, that I was the type of person who might try to cheat her store. "The bill is real," I said firmly, my patience beginning to wear thin. "It came from the ATM at First National Bank this morning." I was still trying to give her a chance to complete the transaction professionally, but Victoria seemed determined to make this simple purchase as difficult and humiliating as possible. "ATM, sure," Victoria said with another dismissive laugh. "Look, I'm going to need to verify this with my manager before I can accept it." The statement was so absurd that I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what she had just said. "You are the manager," I pointed out, indicating the name tag that clearly identified her as the store manager. "Your name tag says Victoria, store manager. Who exactly are you planning to verify this with?" Victoria's face flushed slightly, apparently realizing that her fabricated excuse made no sense. But instead of backing down or apologizing for the confusion, she doubled down on her hostile behavior. "Fine, I'll accept your money this time," she said grudgingly, as if she were doing me an enormous favor by allowing me to purchase an item from her store with legal tender. "But I want you to know that we keep track of customers who cause problems." "Cause problems?" I repeated, genuinely bewildered by her characterization of our interaction. "I haven't caused any problems. I selected an item, brought it to the counter, and offered to pay the listed price. That's how retail transactions are supposed to work." Victoria's expression grew even more hostile. "Don't get smart with me," she snapped. "I know your type. You come in here acting all innocent, but you're just looking for ways to cause trouble or get something for nothing. I've been managing retail stores for 8 years, and I can spot a problem customer from across the room." The conversation had moved so far beyond normal customer service that I felt like I was witnessing some kind of psychological experiment. Victoria had created an entire negative narrative about me, based solely on my appearance and my decision to pay cash for a small purchase. She had transformed a routine transaction into a confrontation that existed entirely in her own mind. "I'm not looking to cause trouble," I said as calmly as I could manage. "I just want to buy this car charger and go about my day. Can we please just complete the transaction?" Victoria finally, grudgingly, began ringing up the purchase, but she continued her verbal assault throughout the process. "You know, this store caters to serious electronics customers," she announced to anyone within hearing distance. "People who buy real equipment, not just cheap accessories. Maybe you'd be more comfortable shopping at one of those discount stores in the lower level." The suggestion that I should shop elsewhere because my purchase wasn't expensive enough was the final straw. I realized that Victoria wasn't just having a bad day or dealing with some personal issue that was affecting her customer service. She was deliberately creating a hostile environment because she had decided that I didn't meet her standards as a customer worthy of respectful treatment. "Actually," I said, my voice still calm but with a new edge of determination, "I think I'd like to speak to the owner of this store about the customer service I'm receiving today." Victoria's laugh was sharp and mean. "The owner? Honey, the owner of this store doesn't waste time talking to customers who complain about paying $20 for a car charger. He's got real business to worry about, not petty complaints from people who think they deserve special treatment." "I don't want special treatment," I replied. "I want basic courtesy, which should be the standard for every customer, regardless of how much they're spending." "Basic courtesy," Victoria repeated mockingly. "Let me tell you something about basic courtesy. It works both ways. When customers come into my store dressed like they just rolled out of bed, paying with crumpled cash for the cheapest item on the shelf, they get exactly the level of service they've earned." The two male employees were watching this entire exchange with obvious discomfort. clearly aware that their manager was behaving inappropriately but apparently too intimidated or uncertain to intervene. Other customers in the store had started to notice the commotion, some pulling out their phones to record what was becoming an increasingly dramatic scene. "So you're saying that you judge customers based on their clothing and the amount they're spending?" I asked, wanting to make sure I fully understood her position. "Absolutely," Victoria said with obvious pride. "That's called being a smart businesswoman." I focused my attention on customers who actually matter to this store's bottom line, not on people who waste my time with tiny purchases and then complain when they don't get treated like royalty. Victoria had just explicitly admitted to the exact discriminatory behavior that customers had been complaining about. She wasn't just failing to provide good customer service. She was actively proud of her policy of treating people differently based on their appearance and spending power. "That's an interesting business philosophy," I said carefully. "I'm curious, though. What if you're wrong about someone? What if someone who doesn't look wealthy actually has significant spending power? Or what if they have connections that could impact your store in ways you haven't considered?" Victoria's expression became even more condescending. "Look, lady, I've been doing this for 8 years. I can tell within 30 seconds whether someone is worth my time or not. You walk in here wearing clothes that probably came from a thrift store, carrying a bag that looks like it's seen better days, and you want to buy the cheapest item in the entire store. I don't need to wonder about your spending power or your connections. It's pretty obvious what your situation is. What if you're completely wrong about my situation?" I pressed, genuinely curious to see how far she would take this. Victoria looked me up and down with obvious disdain. "Wrong? About what? About the fact that you're probably struggling to pay rent? About the fact that $20 is a significant purchase for you? About the fact that you don't have any real influence or connections that could affect my business? Please. I wasn't born yesterday." The certainty in her voice was remarkable. Victoria had constructed an entire detailed story about my life and circumstances based on nothing more than my choice to wear comfortable clothes and pay cash for a small purchase. She was so convinced of her assessment that she couldn't even imagine the possibility that her assumptions might be incorrect. "You seem very confident in your ability to read people," I observed. "Have you ever been wrong about a customer? Ever had someone surprise you?" "Never," Victoria said firmly. "Well, maybe once or twice someone turned out to have a little more money than I initially thought, but I've never been completely wrong about someone's basic situation. And I'm definitely not wrong about yours." Victoria completed the transaction with obvious reluctance, practically throwing my receipt at me across the counter. "There, you've got your $20 car charger. I hope it works out for you. And maybe next time you're shopping, you might want to consider whether a store like this is really the right fit for your budget." As she handed me the small bag containing my purchase, Victoria made one final comment that she clearly intended as a parting insult. "You know, there are some really nice discount stores in this mall where people in your situation might feel more comfortable. Places where the staff won't expect you to make substantial purchases or worry about whether you can actually afford what you're buying." Victoria had no idea that the situation she was so confident about assessing was that I was married to the man who owned the entire shopping center where her store was located. She had no clue that her behavior was being observed not just by a random customer, but by someone who had direct access to the person who controlled her store's lease agreement and could influence her employment situation with a single phone conversation. But more than that, Victoria had demonstrated something that went far beyond poor customer service. She had revealed a mindset that valued people based solely on their appearance and perceived economic status. She had shown that she believed some customers deserved dignity and respect, while others did not, based entirely on superficial judgments about their clothing and spending power. As I stood there holding my $20 purchase, I made a decision. I was going to give Victoria an opportunity to understand the true impact of her behavior, not just on me personally, but on the reputation of David's shopping center and the other businesses that depended on creating a welcoming environment for all customers. I pulled out my phone, which Victoria probably assumed was an old, cheap model based on her assessment of my financial situation. In reality, it was the latest model iPhone that David had surprised me with for our anniversary, But I had chosen a simple, understated case because I preferred not to draw attention to expensive possessions. "I think I'm going to take your suggestion about speaking to the owner," I said calmly. "In fact, I'm going to call him right now." Victoria's expression showed amusement rather than concern. "Good luck with that," she said sarcastically. "I'm sure Mr. Thompson will be very interested in your complaint about paying $20 for a car charger. I'm sure he'll drop everything to deal with your urgent customer service issue." The mention of David's name confirmed that Victoria knew exactly who owned the shopping center where she worked. She was so confident in her assessment of my situation that she felt comfortable mocking the idea that her ultimate landlord would take my complaint seriously. "Actually," I said, scrolling through my contacts to find David's number, "I think he'll be very interested in this conversation, more interested than you might expect." Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically. "Right. Because you have the personal phone number of one of the most successful real estate developers in the state. Let me guess. You're going to pretend to be his wife or something equally ridiculous." The suggestion was so close to the truth that I almost smiled. Victoria had stumbled onto the correct answer, while intending to mock what she saw as an obviously absurd possibility. She was so certain that someone dressed like me couldn't possibly have any real connection to David Thompson that she had mentioned the truth as an example of the kind of ridiculous lies she expected me to tell. "Something like that," I said quietly, pressing David's contact information. The phone rang twice before he answered, and I could hear the surprise and concern in his voice when he realized I was calling from the mall. "Rachel? Is everything okay? How's your investigation going?" "Hi, David," I said clearly, making sure Victoria could hear every word of the conversation. "I'm at Tech Zone Express in Westfield Plaza, and I think you need to come down here. I've found exactly the kind of customer service problem that people have been complaining about." Victoria's expression began to change as she realized that I actually was speaking to someone, that this wasn't some elaborate bluff or performance for her benefit. The confident smirk started to fade from her face, replaced by the first hint of uncertainty I had seen since walking into her store. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, David said immediately. "Are you safe? Do you need me to call mall security?" "I'm fine," I assured him. "Just bring your identification as the property owner. I think there are some things you'll want to address personally." After I ended the call, Victoria was staring at me with a completely different expression. The arrogant certainty had been replaced by obvious confusion and the beginning of what might have been fear. "Who were you really talking to?" she demanded, her voice lacking the confident authority it had held just moments before. "David Thompson," I replied simply. "My husband, the man who owns this entire mall, including the lease agreement for your store.